Current meta. Yeah. G'day folks, ZiggyD here. Taking a break from dissecting the league mechanics. I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the melee experience, especially for Warcries and Slams right now. This style of Earthshatter Warcry build is something that I never really wanted to mess around with too much after my first go with it when they first made the Exert Warcry changes quite a while back now. I didn't want to play it again. I was like, that's too much, that's not very comfortable, that's not very fun, and that's not very rewarding for the effort. But with all the melee buffs this league, I did want to give it a go, and with the cozy vibes of the Settlers of Kalgur expansion, I really wanted to make it as comfortable as possible. Firstly, it seemed like you could not really go wrong with your class choices, so I had a lot of trouble deciding between things like Jugg, Berserker, and Slayer and Gladiator all seem like very good options, and even alternative setups as Chieftain and things like that seem very good too. So a lot of good choices, and everyone I talk to has been playing different versions, are happy with it. Like, I'm happy with my Jugg, people are happy with their Gladiators, people are happy with their Slayers and whatnot, and it seems like things are in a pretty good state in terms of this actually being a buff to the playability of melee. I still think they could go further a little bit with like rewarding melee in terms of like how hard they can punish a boss or whatever when they get that kind of window to do so. But anyway, I'm playing a Earthshatter Slam Jugg, and it has been exceptionally fun and comfortable league starter, and I've had such a good time with kind of tinkering with it and actually playing it way beyond what I ever expected, even with this whole like exert thing. I'm still not sure about the whole exert mechanic in general, whether I love it as a design concept, but I do have to say I've really enjoyed playing this character, and I expected to do the wide ground slam, the ground slam of thickness that I can't remember the name of, ground slam of girth I believe it's called, but I actually just ended up kept coming back to Earthshatter, that satisfying pop when you trigger those Warcries, or when you manually do the Warcries, or when the Warcries happen automatically, or I called them Autocries. It's kind of perfect. It feels so good. It feels so good. So this is kind of less of a build guide and more of a discussion on some of the tools and things we have available to make this sort of playstyle very comfortable right now, so that maybe you can incorporate it into your own build. And that's just because like my build's pretty closely based on Alkaiser's Slam Jugg, and there are plenty of other guides out there for that sort of stuff. I will link my build down in the description below so you can see kind of how I've changed things to make them more comfortable, but I just wanted to focus on the mechanics here. And the star of the show in the gameplay that you may enjoy the look of is all of the corpse explosions. This playstyle already had access to Infernal Cry, so that when you use that, you can do a satisfying big explosion on pack, both the explosion when they die and the combust effect is very nice. But that doesn't give you kind of like that full uptime of the pops. And when you play Jugg instead of Gladiator, you're like, I bet I would have liked the bleed explosions. Well, Kaom's command is here for us now, and I just got one through a shipment. I thought I'd chuck it on and try it out, and I fell in love with it. So this helmet gives some Warcry speed and area of effect, which just makes this playstyle even more comfortable. But most importantly, it does nearby corpses explode when you Warcry, dealing 10% of their life as physical damage, or up to. And that is triggering on both manual Warcries and Autoexert automatic Warcries, and it just destroys all of the corpses around you, and it makes this sort of playstyle scale really well into higher density content. And oh my god, the sound and the look of it and the feel of it is immensely satisfying. I really like doing things like Expedition, so this is just perfect for that, because as soon as you start getting those first kills, you do like Combust Infernal Cry, and then those kill things and those leave corpses, and as you run around, you trigger giant corpse explosion chains that just murder everything, and it is brilliant, especially for solo play of kind of like blasting through maps. Obviously, you wouldn't use this helmet when you go to fight pinnacle bosses. I have fought like Uber Elder and stuff, but not Ubers. You wouldn't really use this. You would just whack on some other helmet with some nice defensive or offensive bonuses. But for the map clearing and the gold farming, which is where my focus lies, Kaom's Command is an absolute treat and definitely an improvement in both the fun and playability of any melee Warcry oriented build. So the next thing I want to talk about is Warcries and Autoexert. So Autoexert is a new gem that was added to the game that allows you to automatically trigger your Warcries. You lose the buff effects of those Warcries, but I think people over kind of estimated how important that is, because a lot of the buff effects often just don't matter to your build, or are like pretty small ultimately, and the Warcries do so much outside of that. Any sort of like taunting effects still work, so debuffs on enemies and things like that, and any of the exert effects still work. So you'll actually, when you kind of look at each Warcry, many of them, you still get all of the effects that you really want, and there's not too much actual trade-off here. Of course, this does reserve some mana per Warcry, but it's 15% base per Warcry, so if you do 3 Warcries, that's 45%. And there's some blue text on them that says that mana reservation cannot be further modified. That's actually doesn't mean that you can't modify it at all. That's just because each one has 15% and then you modify that amount. You just can't double dip, because that if that blue text wasn't there, you would effectively, your mana reservation efficiency would apply twice. So it would, it's just to avoid that. So you can actually end up getting it pretty cheap. So my 3 linked Warcries are 35% mana reservation with my current setup, and I get that down below 30 easy. And the trade-off, absolutely worth it. So worth it. So especially when you factor in the new support gem for Overexertion, which gives more damage if exerted, and then more damage for each Warcry actually exerting the skill. So it gives a massive amount of damage when you're able to stack so many extra exerts, and you can't really be expecting to use like 5 or 6 Warcries manually. That's just ridiculous. It's the sort of thing that maybe you would do in between boss phases to prepare some big slams for a boss. But for like regular gameplay, no chance. But Overexertion compared with that Autoexert works a treat. So I'll go over some of the Warcries that I use on Autoexert and ones that I think are better left off of Autoexert and talk a bit more about that. But first, there is worth mentioning the tech, the new secret tech for Autoexert for an Earthshatter build in particular is General's Cry. So the Warcries normally have 8 seconds cooldown, and General's Cry only has a 3 seconds cooldown. Now, of course, you actually get a bunch of cooldown recovery, and that makes General's Cry, with my current setup, only have a cooldown of 1.2 seconds. So that thing is going off almost once every second, and with the other Warcries linked there, you are averaging a Warcry automatically every second or so. So that means you just slam your Earthshatters, and you can actually run around without casting any Warcries manually at all, and it will feel like a faster, more explosive, cooler Earthquake, in my opinion. So you can play this as a very lazy style and have those extra manual Warcries on your bar for when you want a big power boost, and you will want to do them. You will actually want to push those buttons. I think people overstate the multi-button thing, and the only time I've ever really found that to be a problem is when it's something that you have to do every single time. When it's something that you do only occasionally when you want a big power boost, then I think pushing extra buttons feels good. Actually fun, right? Like we play games, pushing buttons are part of it. Pushing buttons should be fun, and it's fun when they do a lot. So for example, when you run into a big pack and you press your Infernal Cry and everything gets debuffed, and then you whack them and they explode with a massive explosion, then that feels fun and rewarding. And you only need to push that Infernal Cry when you do run into a big pack and want that giant explosion. It's not necessary otherwise. And for example, another one that I manually use is Rallying Cry. This one gives you a bunch of extra damage, only necessary when you want to kill like a pretty tanky rare or a boss. So only something you have to use occasionally and not constantly. Seismic Cry gives you a bunch of AoE, good if monsters are spread out, or if you want to pair it with Infernal Cry to make an even bigger explosion, then that's the only time you really need to push Seismic Cry. And of course, if you're fighting a very tough monster, then you might want to stack all of your Warcries together and get those big bonks. But you really don't have to push these buttons all of the time, just kind of as you feel like you want those power boosts. And I think that kind of power boost reward to the button push ratio is feeling quite good for me. It does feel a lot better as you gain additional Warcry cooldown and Warcry speed. At this point, with a setup oriented around this and a couple Warcry clusters, because some of the rewards I'll talk about later from those are really, really good, you end up getting a lot of Warcry speed, Warcry AoE, Warcry cooldown, and this all becomes way faster and comfier to use. But back on the auto-exert side of things, so apart from that neat little General's Cry, but the other Warcries that I do exert are Intimidating Cry. The buff for Intimidating Cry is a bit of movement speed, so that while that's good, it's not really a big deal to lose that. But it does give double damage on its exert, and that's kind of something you just want up all of the time. It also has a pretty low exert count, 3 with the Warcry clusters for the extra exert. Pressing a Warcry every 3 attacks is that's the stuff that's bad. That's the uncomfy thing. But auto exerting that with the cooldown, you actually get, depending on your attack speed, pretty close to full uptime on that. So that's definitely one to auto-exert in my opinion. And the other one I auto-exert is actually really, really nice, and that's Battlemages Cry. So that gives crit. If you're a non-crit build, you literally don't care. I'm a resolute technique build. I think a lot of these sorts of builds do tend to be. So losing that crit, not a big deal. But it does give you the ability to trigger a supported spell with your melee attacks, which I just linked to vulnerability. So we auto-cast vulnerability on hit. It's a great way to get vulnerability on hit, in addition to the extra exerts for your bonus exert damage from overexertion. So very, very cool stuff. So if you don't use that General's Cry tech, maybe because you're not playing Earthshatter or you find that it's triggering enough anyway, you can offload Seismic or Infernal Cry over to the auto-exert setup, especially Infernal Cry if you're not doing elemental damage, if you're using Brutality, for example, because the buff from Infernal Cry is added fire damage from physical. So not a big deal if you lose that if you're already using Brutality anyway. You still get all of the explosions. Side note, Infernal Cry works with Brutality on your main skill because the Combust and the explosions are separate things. And the nice thing is the explosions don't reflect, so you can do Elemental Reflex with Infernal Cry still even. I think the only time there's ever any little risk there with Infernal Cry is the Combust effect from the Exert, because that does have some fire conversion and you can't link that to Brutality. I only found that to be a problem on really dense packs with like Cannot Die auras and stuff, so you can be a little careful with Infernal Cry in Ele Reflect maps. Another huge tip is that in addition to the General's Cry tech, another way with Earthshatter to make sure that your Warcries are automatically spamming very frequently to trigger those is that Quality gives cooldown recovery on Warcries, right? So that's something you really, really want. On everything except General's Cry, it gives a pretty big amount of cooldown recovery, 40% at max quality. And that is huge for keeping up your exerts and making sure they're available when you want them. But you can do a clever little thing. Auto-exertion will normally trigger, let's say you link 2 8-second cooldown Warcries to auto-exertion, it'll trigger them at the exact same time. So that's really not very helpful in terms of triggering your Earthshatters. But if you put a bit of quality on one, or if the qualities are a few percentage points different, let's say one is 20% and the other one is 15%, then they will go out of sync of each other and they will cast in alternate succession. So you'll get one cry going and then like a second or two later, you'll get the other one going off. So just staggering those qualities can be a really good way of just having extra automatic Warcries going off to trigger your Earthshatters, making for a very comfortable playstyle. And you really can, with the 3 or even just 2 with alternate qualities, run around and just have Earthshatter do itself. I also wanted to showcase some passives and especially the masteries on the Warcries. These things are very nice, and it is worth mentioning that especially if you have a faster attack speed, which I, for the comfort of the playstyle, really rate anything over 1.4, 1.45. I had a 1.5 axe for a while, and that felt really, really nice to play. I know some people do like to use those big, heavy-hitting, maybe even high DPS 1.2 attacks axes. I just think that's much less comfortable to play. You run into situations where you get killed while you're like winding up for an attack, or you accidentally animation cancel when you go to move, things like that. But regardless of what axe type you choose, generally speaking, cooldown recovery rate is actually going to be one of the biggest DPS increases you can get because it ensures that more of your attacks are covered by more of your exerts. In theory, if you got enough cooldown and you had a slow enough attack, you could have all of your exerts affecting all of your attacks all of the time for maximum damage. But really, more cooldown on most builds is going to mean especially more uptime on your Intimidating Cry double damage effect. So very, very good stuff to get. It makes Deep Breaths cluster really good, but, and one that's often overlooked is these little nodes behind here. Also, these ones here, when I first allocated these were like over 5% total damage each for single point nodes like that. Pretty big deal. Side note, Escalation gives up to 60% damage, and it's always 60% damage, basically, in this sort of playstyle. This only works when you are affected by a buff, which is any of the ones you manually cast yourself. But that can be up 100% of the time very easily. And it certainly will be up 100% of the time when you need it, like, say, against a boss, because you'll be using your Warcries more regularly there. So I also wanted to talk about these phenomenal Warcry masteries. I want, like, 4 of them. They're so good. I would take all of them, honestly, if I could. If I didn't have to go get the clusters, I would take all of them. So, there's a very cool pairing here. Warcries have minimum 10 power, is well known. It allows you to kind of activate the buffs even if there's no enemies around. So that is nice, but more importantly, it allows you to combine it with the Rage Mastery here to say Warcries grant 1 rage per 5 enemy power up to 5. So this is an interesting combo, and you would think in some, like, you would maybe think that it doesn't work because, like, the power is about getting the buffs right, and you won't get buffs from Autoexert, but you still get the rage from the Autoexert. You can run around with your Autoexert Warcries giving you 2 rage every single time they trigger, which actually just means you have max rage all the time. You never, like, go into a boss and have to generate rage, you just have full rage all the time, and that setup alone, those 2 masteries, with an Autoexert setup means you don't need really any other rage generation to maintain rage as long as you're not using Berserk. If you get other rage generation, you can consider using Berserk, but without it, it's just max rage all the time. Very, very good. Warcries debilitate enemies, gives less movement speed and 10% less damage on enemies, and that one is both Autoexert and manual Warcries. So when you have automatic exerts going off, automatic Warcries going off basically every second. So that means that's got 100% uptime. Remove all damaging ailments when you Warcries, also phenomenal. That only works when you manually cast them. And with the speed these get, they are very quick. So even if you're running around and need to pop one of those off just real quick, that's nearly as good as a flask for removing those. So very nice kind of insurance against those different ailments. I also did test the Recover Life when you use a Warcry. That also only works on manual ones, sadly. That would be pretty OP if it worked on the Auto-Exerts. But it's also, I really liked it as well. So any like challenging content where you're going to be kind of stuck in a fight for a while, maybe like a boss fight or something where you might be running out of life flasks, that I rate that highly. Just not quite as highly as the 3 that I currently have. The Warcries cannot exert travel skills is pretty essential if you're using Leap Slam and don't want them to trigger on your Leap Slam, because that will effectively lower your damage. But you can get a Betrayal Craft on an Amulet Suffix, that's like 1 alch there. So as long as you make sure you have a free suffix on your Amulet, you can get that there instead and save that mastery for something better. But early game, I did use that for a while. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is mana solving options. They made some changes to mana this time around. And I kind of hate mana in Path of Exile a lot of the time. But I do have to admit some of the changes they have made and some of the tools we have available now does make solving mana a fair bit more versatile for a build like this and a bit more interesting. I have had moments where I've thought, that was actually kind of like an interesting moment of clever problem solving. So I do have to hand him that. Mana has gotten a little bit more interesting to solve in builds like this, and it does feel like we have a lot of flexibility and options to fine tune and tinker with that. It could be a bit frustrating if you don't know the options available to you though, so I'll just go over some of them now, but there are lots more, honestly. And it's often a combination approach that's going to end up working for you to kind of solve mana, to make that build, that playstyle really comfortable, where you never really want to be running out of mana. You don't want to ever not be able to slam or leap or whatever because you run out of mana. And you also want to have some flexibility to deal with different things, like situations where you have some monsters that can't be leeched from, or you get something that kind of like drains your mana for a bit, or maybe even the ability to do cannot leech maps, for example. So, as always though, of course, minus mana cost on jewelry, these crafts are king. You really can't beat them. 2 or 3 of these often in your build will just outright solve your mana problems. Of course, that does mean several affixes on your jewelry, which can be quite valuable, are dedicated to that, but generally, at least on your rings, that's pretty worth the trade-off. As they are prefixes, you can get something like life, minus mana cost, and Phys damage, and still have a good set of 3 prefixes without losing too much. I used none of these for quite some time and was able to very comfortably come up with other solutions. And I did for quite some time just use one of these with some bit of combined approach. And I've now kind of that my gear's getting a bit better. I have transitioned into 2 of these with just a little bit of other stuff sprinkled in. Another side note that I'll mention is that Blood Magic's actually in a pretty good state now. Lots of builds do legitimately go for Blood Magic in this style. You do get a free aura from Eternal Blessing, which is always great. And the trade-off ends up being fairly worth it a lot of the time. So if you want the simplest approach, then Blood Magic with an Eternal Blessing aura is a very solid answer to solving mana. Similarly, I actually do rate Life Tap support as a pretty viable choice. It's only a bit worse damage-wise than some other supports you have access to. And at least early on, it can be a very nice solution for solving mana until you find other more elegant solutions that allow you to squeeze a bit more damage out of a different support gem instead. And you can also use this just on other skills, like for example Leap Slam. Before you get minus mana cost rings, putting Life Tap on your Leap Slam can be really nice. The little cute thing that's easy to forget is that the Life Tap buff itself actually gives life recovery from flasks, so you like get a little bonus there as well. Some of the kind of stuff that we got that's a bit new is the ability to do more to be able to reduce mana costs. And it is actually quite valid to try and find an equilibrium point where you reduce mana costs to below that of your current mana generation. So things like these attack and mana cost and cannibalistic rite over here, and these nodes over here that also do similar things. As well, of course, up in Templar, you have things like Tireless that reduce mana costs and some nodes in the starting area of the tree. You want to be able to do this without spending too much, but sometimes you can actually kind of spend just maybe 3 or 4 passives and actually achieve this, especially with some minus mana cost rings, so it can be a nice combined approach with that, which is kind of what I have currently going on, although I still am using Mana Leech as an important part of actually properly sustaining attacks. But if you can reduce your actual overall mana costs enough, and you can do that by combining something like Cannibalistic Rite to reduce the mana cost, but also convert some of those costs to life, which one of the life masteries can do that as well. So the bottom life mastery there converts another 15%. With that combined, you can actually do something like grab that top mana mastery there for 5% mana per second. Alternatively, reduce mana cost of skills, of course. And you can find that point where you're like, you sim your build on Path of Building here, and you can find out what your actual mana cost per second is. It'll sum total everything up for you. And then if that's lower than your actual mana regeneration rate, then you're good to go, right? And that's something that's very nice because it doesn't rely on Mana Leech at all if you go that route. I have done a bit of that supplemented by Mana Leech currently, but that does mean that I can't run like Cannot Leech maps without at least swapping in something like Life Tap. A good thing about reducing mana costs both through nodes like this and the minus mana cost jewelry is that while they may only have a limited effect on your main skill that costs like, 50, 60, 70 mana or whatever, and they did increase some of those recently, your other skills that spam frequently but don't cost much actually will get reduced down to 0 or close to. So something that people were worried about with Autoexert, for example, was that they would cost a lot of mana, but Autoexert actually sets all of its Warcries costs to 10. So a minus mana cost ring reduces them down to 3. If you've got some like conversion to life, that might be basically nothing. If you've got a little bit of other reduced mana costs, you're basically going to be nothing. And two minus mana cost rings, yeah, literally nothing. So my Autoexert Warcries are free. My manual Warcries are very cheap, and my Leap Slam costs 1 life. So that means even like in a no regen or a reduced regen map, you can leap around, your Warcries can pop off, and it's never going to be a problem. So that's really comfortable. Another big thing is, of course, Mana Leech. The tiniest bit of Mana Leech can make all of the difference. A piece of jewelry like this that has one little Mana Leech affix on there, on that prefix, for example, it might cost a life slot or a damage slot, so that's not necessarily an ideal place to get it, but it can be an option. But even just one point like that of 0.33 Mana Leech can be enough when combined with some of the other mana cost reduction approaches. You do have to make sure you have enough mana open on your reservation to be able to use your attack 2-3 times at least. That just gives you time for your Mana Leech to actually kick in. You don't want to like attack once and then you can't attack again, and you have to kind of wait for the damage to be dealt before you can attack again, because that creates like pauses in your actual attacks. So as long as you can do like 2 or 3 attacks, then your Mana Leech will have time to kick in, and Mana Leech can feel very comfortable. There are lots of other good options for getting Mana Leech. Spirit of War here gives 0.5, which is more than enough for most attack builds. There's quite a bit over on like the Ranger Duelist side over here, and obviously ton up by Shadow and things like that if you're playing like a Warden or whatever. But another really good place to get Mana Leech is actually Jewels. This duel looks kind of trash, but Path of Building actually calculated as like one of the highest DPS duels I could get on the market. The combination of kind of like bleed and Phys damage scales really well here, and the Mana Leech was a great problem solver. But Mana Leech being a prefix means that you can get like life and then Mana Leech, and then you can grab a pair of nice suffixes for your build. That can be a really nice kind of like a low opportunity cost to work in a better Mana Leech to your build. So hopefully that gives you some tools for solving mana on these sorts of builds. Like, I think you have so many options now you can combine together little bits here and there to try and make this work pretty elegant and try and fit it build and make it comfortable, but also like not have too much opportunity cost for it. I'm at like 2 passives, a dual slot, and some ring affixes. I'm kind of overdoing it a bit, but it feels very comfortable. Some quick final words. I just wanted to talk also about just how much kind of like versatility you have in these sorts of playstyles now. You have lots of choices for like kind of tinkering and tailoring yourself more to damage for, you know, more bossing or thicker content, or more for clear speed if you're like farming gold or doing high density content, or and more for survivability if that's the thing you need to kind of like perk up a little bit, for example. Even just in Jugg, right, like you have a lot of flexibility in what you take. So Unbreakable is undoubtedly very good defensive buff, but that's not what I need right now. I'm like going more for clear speed, right? So Unyielding here is lots of extra AoE and damage and feels very comfortable. Something I'm curious to try for like really ramping up that survivability a lot and making things more comfortable to play is I'm interested in trying Lust for Carnage and the Instant Leech Mastery. That effectively turning some of your leech into life gain on hit can be insanely powerful with a setup like this, especially that hits many times, right? Earthshatter triggering up to like 9 explosions at a time, as well as lots of frequent attacks. And even things like Combust, which actually deal attack damage, can also leech, right? So the instant leech from Combustion should like fill your life up really quickly. So I'm interested in messing around with some of that. Things like the Fortify Mastery here, melee hits Fortify, are just such a like solid solution to just get a ton of extra survivability. You can grab like maximum fortification, get some extra regen out of it, and just grab Fortify, right? It works so beautifully in a build like this. We have access to tons more max resistance now. This cluster over here gives lots of max resistance, and so does this one over here. And that, in addition to the change to endurance charges, which now mitigate elemental damage, means you can get a lot of really nice elemental mitigation. And those protection masteries are really good too. You have options for corrupting blood immunity, which corrupting blood's not an ailment, so try and remember that. You need to get separate kind of immunity for that. And even things like your elemental resistances cannot be lowered by curses, so you can run elemental weakness maps without like overcapping your resist massively. On a Jugg where we have like removal of damaging ailments, we're basically immune to anything that can slow us down thanks to Unstoppable, immune to corrupting blood, we can tinker just to make ourselves able to run elemental weakness maps, lots of options to solve mana, and then if we run into a situation where it's not working, we can easily change like a gem or one passive or something and make it work. Lots of flexibility here. I do also like that you're less pigeonholed now into Phys taken as elemental damage, which used to be kind of like just the thing you had to get lots and lots of once you got to tier 16-ish maps and wanted to push deeper into more juiced up content. You basically had to get lots of that. There is still a little bit of that, like for example, the implicit here for Phys taken as lightning is still very good, especially combined with the increased elemental mitigation we have right now. And overall, like our Phys max hit has kind of gone down a bit. But that's been traded off for a lot of extra elemental mitigation, which feels like a decent trade-off. But most importantly, not being forced into getting so much of that. Like, I would have had a hard time justifying Kaom's command before when I really wanted to get those, like, that large amount of extra Phys taken as elemental on a helmet usually. But I feel much more free to actually use a fun item like this now, so that's a good outcome from that. Anyway, that's a lot of hopefully somewhat interesting, entertaining rambling about the current state of Melee. And maybe some useful things you can implement into some of your Melee builds. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you found any cool tools or interesting masteries or little techniques or things that you can incorporate into these sorts of playstyles. Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.